The blizzard that descended upon Thunder Mesa on the 14th of January 1857 was not merely cold. It was a living thing, malevolent and purposeful, as if winter itself had grown teeth and decided to feed. The wind came down from the mountains with a voice that sounded like 10,000 wolves, howling in unison, driving snow so hard that each flake became a tiny blade against exposed flesh. Men who had lived through 30 Wyoming winters swore they had never seen its equal. The temperature had fallen to something close to 30 degrees below zero cold, enough that breath froze in the lungs before it could be exhaled, cold enough that leather became brittle as old parchment, cold enough that the iron of a rifle barrel would strip the skin from a man's palm if he was fool enough to touch it with a bare hand. In the center of the town's frozen main thoroughfare, perhaps 60 souls had gathered despite the murderous weather. They were bundled in every scrap of wool and fur they possessed, and their faces hidden beneath scarves pulled so tight that only their eyes were visible. Eyes that glittered with something that might have been righteousness or might have been something far uglier. The snow beneath their boots had been compressed by weeks of cold into a substance harder than pine boards, and each footfall produced a sound like glass breaking in a distant room. They pressed forward with the peculiar determination of people who had convinced themselves that what they were about to do was not cruelty, but justice, not murder, but duty. Above them extended from a porch beam with carpentry that was rough but adequate to its terrible purpose, a noose swung in the wind. The rope was new hemp, still golden, despite the snow that gathered in its coils and froze there. It moved with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like a serpent testing the air before it struck. Beneath that rope, a young woman knelt on the ice in her bare feet. Her name was Hazel Kowalczyk, though most of those assembled did not know it and would not have cared if they had. To them, she was simply the murderess, the foreign woman, the beast. A creature that had somehow slipped through the cracks of civilization and needed to be put down before she could do more damage. She appeared to be perhaps 23 years of age, though suffering had aged her in ways that transcended the merely physical. Her ankles were bound with iron shackles of the sort used to restrain livestock, or the violently insane rusted orange-brown where the metal had drunk deep of her blood. The flesh around the iron had swollen into shapes that no longer resembled human anatomy, purple and gray and black, the colors of tissue dying by degrees. Her feet, pressed flat against the frozen ground, had split open at the toes and heels from frostbite and rough treatment, and the wounds had frozen into small sculptures of brown ice mixed with darker red. Someone, perhaps in haste, perhaps in deliberate humiliation, had taken shears to her hair, hacking it away in ragged chunks that stood up from her scalp at chaotic angles. The crude cutting exposed not just the vulnerable curve of her skull, but also the constellation of bruises that marked her neck and jawline like a map of violence, green and yellow, where they had begun to heal black and purple, where fists and fingers had pressed deep enough to nearly stop her breathing entirely. A burlap hood stiff with dried blood and filth hung from her shoulders. The coarse fabric had abraded her collarbone, raw, leaving burns that wept clear fluid in the killing cold. But what struck anyone who looked closely, and few dared to, was not the catalogue of injuries, but the expression on her face. She did not weep. She did not beg. She did not even seem to see the crowd that surrounded her baying for her blood. Instead, her gray eyes were fixed on some point beyond the visible world. Some distant place where nooses and mobs and pain could not reach. Her jaw was set with a determination that spoke not of defiance, but of something deeper, a fundamental refusal to surrender the last piece of herself that remained her own. Whatever they took from her, and they had taken nearly everything, they would not take that. "She is a beast," growled a rancher named Bowen, his face flushed red beneath his beaverskin hat, whether from cold or whiskey or the peculiar fever that sometimes seized men when violence was near. "Not fit to breathe Christian air." The word rippled outward through the assembled crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Beast, beast, beast. Each repetition stripped away another layer of the woman's humanity, made what they were about to do a little easier to justify when they laid their heads down to sleep that night, if sleep would come at all. Behind the kneeling prisoner stood Alma Cartwright, a widow of some 62 years, whose silver hair was bound beneath a black wool shawl that had been her mother's in the old country. Her face weathered by 6 decades of prairie winters, and personal sorrows that would have broken lesser souls, was set in an expression of grim defiance that would have done credit to any general preparing for a last stand. She bent once more to pull the filthy burlap over the young woman's trembling shoulders, only to have it knocked aside by a man carrying a Sharp's rifle, the heavy buffalo gun that could drop a charging grizzly at 400 yards. "Do not waste your Christian kindness on that one, Alma," the man said, his voice carrying the certainty of the righteous. "She is not human. She has the devil's mark upon her plain as day." Then something changed in the atmosphere of the gathering, a shift so subtle that most did not register it consciously, but felt it nonetheless the way animals feel the approach of a predator before they see or hear it. An Apache warrior appeared at the edge of the circle, materializing from the white curtain of the storm as if conjured. He did not hurry. He did not shout. He simply walked forward through the parting crowd with the unhurried confidence of a man who had faced death so many times that it had become an old acquaintance rather than a terror. And then he dropped to one knee in the snow beside the chained woman. His name was Goyathle, one who yawns, though the Mexicans who had fought him called him Geronimo, and the army scouts who had worked alongside him called him Ghost, because of his uncanny ability to appear and disappear as if the land itself were his ally. He was perhaps 32 years old, though he carried himself with the stillness of someone much older. His face had been carved by wind and hard years into something both fierce and deeply calm. With high cheekbones that spoke of his Apache heritage and a strong jaw that hinted at Spanish or Anglo blood somewhere in his lineage generations back. His eyes, black as obsidian freshly chipped from volcanic glass, swept the crowd with the calm assessment of a man cataloging threats and calculating odds. He wore a war bonnet, though not the elaborate trailing construction of the Lakota or Cheyenne that white men imagined when they thought of Indians. This was simpler, more practical, a band of red and blue beadwork, from which rose perhaps a dozen eagle feathers, each one tipped with red flannel, and representing some act of courage or mercy performed in his past. Some of the feathers bore notches, one for each enemy killed in battle, two for each enemy spared. He wore fringed buckskin darkened by snow and long wear, and across his back was slung a Springfield Model 1855 rifle musket, the standard long arm of the United States Army before the war. At his hip rested a Colt Navy revolver, .36 caliber, 6 shots cap and ball, its walnut grip worn smooth by use. Behind him stood 2 children, wrapped so thoroughly in blankets and rabbit fur that only their dark eyes were visible. The girl appeared to be perhaps 10 years of age, the boy somewhat younger. They watched the proceedings with the wide, frightened eyes of children who had already learned that the world was capable of terrible things and that safety was always temporary. The warrior's gaze settled upon the kneeling woman. With a deliberation that bordered on ceremony, he reached out and placed one broad, calloused palm upon her shoulder. His hand covered the ragged edge of the burlap hood and came to rest upon her bare skin, which was cold as marble quarried from a mountain's heart. She flinched at the contact, a sharp, involuntary jerk, but then went utterly still, as if his hand were an anchor that had arrested her drift toward some final dark shore. He kept his hand there, steady and warm, despite the killing cold, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the howl of the wind, and the murmur of the mob, with the clarity of a bell struck in an empty church. "She is my woman." The Comanche had a word taboo that meant something claimed and therefore sacred. The Apache had a similar concept, though the word was different. among his mother's people to publicly claim responsibility for another person in front of witnesses created a bond as binding as blood kinship, a formal declaration that could not be easily undone. Among the whites, such a declaration meant wife or sister or ward. But in any interpretation, it meant the same thing: harm done to her was harm done to him, and must be answered accordingly by blade or bullet, or the long, patient justice of a people who counted debts across generations. The words fell into the howling storm with the weight of stones dropped into deep water, and the ripples spread outward in ways that would not be fully understood for hours yet. The crowd hesitated. Men shifted their weight, and the sound of boots on packed snow was like small bones breaking in the dark. Those who had pressed closest to the hairline cracks in the ice that covered the wagon ruts took cautious steps backward, suddenly aware of the treacherous ground beneath their feet and what it might mean if the ice gave way. From somewhere near the back of the assembled mob, a voice spoke in accented English that turned even simple words into something elegant and dangerous, like a rapier hidden in a velvet scabbard. "Goyatle, mon ami, you make a most grave mistake." The speaker emerged from the press of bodies with the confidence of a man who believed himself beloved, or at least feared enough that the difference did not matter. This woman is not merely a common criminal. She is a murderess of the most cold-blooded variety who killed one of my men, a good man, a family man, while he slept in his bed. She also stole property of considerable value belonging to the Bitter Creek Mining Company. The law demands justice, and justice demands that rope around her neck. Surely even you can understand that. Remy Duchamp was a Frenchman who had arrived in the territories during the California gold rush of 1849, and finding no gold worth the effort, had discovered something far more valuable: the willingness to do what other men would not, and to profit thereby. He was perhaps 40 years old, handsome in a sharp-featured way that some women found appealing until they looked more closely into his pale blue eyes and saw the calculations happening behind them like an abacus clicking through sums of profit and loss. He wore a great coat of fine wool with brass buttons polished to a mirror's shine, despite the weather boots of tooled leather that gleamed even in the dim light filtering through the storm, and a watch chain of real gold 14-carat purchased in St. Louis that caught what little light there was and threw it back in small defiant flashes. At his hip, holstered in worked leather decorated with silver conchos, was a Colt Dragoon revolver with an ivory grip that had cost him 3 months' wages. Beside Duchamp stood Sheriff Tobias Miles, a man of considerable bulk and remarkably little spine, whose drooping mustache was stained yellow from the tobacco he chewed compulsively whenever stress drove him to it, which was often. His eyes were like river stones that had been washed smooth of any distinguishing characteristics, revealing nothing of what thoughts moved behind them. His badge pinned to his canvas coat with a kind of crooked carelessness that suggested he did not value it highly, was tarnished and dull. His hand rested near his holster, not threatening, not yet, but positioned such that he could draw in under 2 seconds if circumstances required it. Goyatle did not rise from his kneeling position. He simply looked at Remy Duchamp, and then at Sheriff Miles, then at the assembled crowd, his expression undergoing no change whatsoever. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the wind with perfect clarity, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into a well so deep that you never heard it hit bottom. "Anyone who lays hands upon this woman declares war upon me, and through me upon my people in the camps beyond the hills. We are few now, my mother's band, but we remember injuries done to us. We remember them for generations. We teach our children the names of those who wronged us. We wait, if we must, for years or decades, but we always answer debts in blood or honor. This is our way. It has always been our way." The silence that followed was broken only by the creak of the rope in the wind and the howl of the storm, which seemed to have grown suddenly louder, as if nature itself were listening to what would happen next and leaning closer to hear the verdict. Remy Duchamp's face flushed a darker shade, blood rising beneath his skin, in a way that made the small veins at his temples stand out like blue threads stitched beneath parchment. He took a step forward onto the frozen street, then another, his expensive boots crunching on the compressed snow. His gloved hand moved toward the ivory grip of his dragoon revolver in a gesture that was not quite a threat, but was certainly not innocent. You would begin a war, a real war, with soldiers and cannons and burning lodges over this creature. This thing that murdered a man in his sleep. Have you lost your mind entirely? Goyathle's gaze remained fixed and level. And when he spoke, there was no anger in his voice, no heat whatsoever. There was only the cold, flat certainty of a man who had thought through all possible outcomes and had chosen his path regardless of cost. Yes, he said simply, I would. The ice beneath Remy Duchamp's boots produced a sound, then soft, almost conversational, like someone clearing their throat politely to get attention. A hairline crack appeared in the frozen surface, no wider than a knife blade feathering outward in delicate branches, toward a darker patch perhaps 15 feet distant where the Snake River still ran liquid and black, beneath its fragile covering moving at a speed that would sweep a man downstream and under the ice shelf before he could draw breath to scream. Remy glanced down, registered the spreading web of fractures, and halted his advance with a suddenness that might have been comical under other circumstances. The warrior rose slowly to his full height, not tall by white standards, perhaps 5 feet 9 inches, but carrying himself in a way that made him seem larger. His hand remained resting upon the woman's shoulder, and snow had begun to accumulate in the beadwork of his war bonnet, and in the ragged, dark tangle of the woman's shorn hair, as if the storm were trying to bury them both where they stood, and spare everyone the trouble of hanging. This woman will stand before the circuit judge when he arrives from Fort Laramie. Goyathle said, his voice carrying the full weight of his intent, leaving no room for negotiation. If you hang her without trial, the army will send investigators. Questions will be asked that you do not want to answer. Certain arrangements that have been profitable for you will be examined closely. The territorial marshal will come with federal warrants. None of this will end well for anyone here, but if she receives a proper trial before a judge, and if that judge finds her guilty based on evidence rather than fear, and then she will hang according to law, and I will not object. That is my offer. That is the only offer I will make. Sheriff Miles cleared his throat, a wet rattling sound that suggested too many years of tobacco and whiskey and not enough time spent sleeping well. He looked at the crowd, then at the cracking ice beneath Remy's feet, then at the distant hills where thin columns of smoke rose from Apache winter camps. Camps that could be mobilized within hours if the wrong message was sent. Camps that contained perhaps 300 warriors who knew this country better than any white man ever would and who bore grudges that went back generations. He was calculating odds, weighing immediate satisfaction against future costs, performing the same mental arithmetic that had allowed him to survive 4 terms as sheriff in a town where his predecessors had averaged 18 months before being killed or driven out. He lifted one meaty hand in a gesture of authority that his actions had long since rendered hollow. There will be no hanging today, he announced, his voice carrying across the street with what remained of his official capacity, such as it was. The circuit judge is expected within the week, weather permitting. This woman will remain under guard until such time as he arrives and can hear the evidence in a proper court. If the Apache here wishes to assume responsibility for her custody and to stake his own life upon her good behavior, that is his right under territorial law, as I understand it. But mark this, he pointed at Goyathle with a thick finger. If she flees, or if she harms another living soul, your life is forfeit alongside hers. Those are the terms. Accept them or refuse them, but decide now, because I will not make this offer twice. Remy Duchamp's jaw clenched with such force that the muscles jumped beneath his skin like snakes writhing in a sack. A vein pulsed at his temple, thick and dark. But he was a careful man, a man who had survived this long by knowing when to fight and when to appear to yield, while preparing his next move in a game that never truly ended. "This is a mistake, Sheriff," he said, his voice tight as a wire stretched to breaking. "A mistake for which we shall all pay dearly before this winter is through. But if it is the law," he invested the word with a contempt that made it sound obscene, "then so be it. For now." The last two words carried a promise, or perhaps a threat, and everyone present understood exactly what they meant. Goyeth lay bent at the waist and slipped one arm beneath the woman's elbow, lifting her to her feet with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his weathered warrior's exterior. She swayed as her weight came onto her ruined feet, and a sound escaped her throat, not quite a cry more. A sharp exhalation that spoke of agony so intense it had moved beyond expression into something purely physical. A response of nerve and muscle that bypassed thought entirely. He steadied her with his other hand at the small of her back, taking most of her weight against his side so that her feet barely needed to touch the frozen ground. The chains that bound her ankles dragged between them with a sound like wind chimes made of broken glass. For the first time since the ordeal had begun, since she had been dragged from whatever cell or shack they had kept her in and brought here to die, she turned her head and looked directly at him. Her lips cracked and colorless from cold and dehydration moved. The words that emerged were shaped by an accent he could not immediately place, though he had heard enough Polish and Russian in his years as an army scout to recognize the general region. "Why?" She whispered the word barely audible above the wind, each letter shaped with visible effort. "Why you do this for me, you not know me. I am nothing to you." He did not answer because there was no time for answers, and perhaps because he did not yet know the answer himself. He had acted on instinct, the same instinct that had saved his life in a dozen firefights, the same instinct that had allowed him to survive when other scouts had died with arrows in their backs or Comanche lances through their chests. He had looked at this woman kneeling in the snow and had seen something that he recognized from his own mirror, something that spoke of a refusal to submit even when submission would have been easier, even when submission might have meant survival. He had seen someone worth saving in a world that seemed dedicated to destroying anything good or decent that still remained. So instead of answering, he simply began to guide her forward one agonizing step at a time through the parting crowd. People drew back as they passed, some out of respect and others out of fear, and more than a few out of a shame they would not fully acknowledge until darkness fell, and they lay alone with their thoughts and the memory of what they had nearly done. Behind them, Remy Duchamp stood motionless on the cracking ice, his gloved hand still resting upon the ivory grip of his revolver, watching them recede into the white curtain of the storm. His face had settled into an expression of cold calculation and the look of a man already planning his next move in a game where the stakes were his fortune, his freedom, and quite possibly his life. Because the truth which he had not shared with the mob would never share with anyone if he could help it, was that the ledger this woman had stolen did not merely document the trafficking of immigrant women, terrible as that was. It also contained careful records of his embezzlement from the mining company's silver shipments, evidence of systematic theft that had netted him perhaps $20,000 over 3 years. If that ledger reached the company's owners in Philadelphia, they would not send marshals or lawmen. They would send the kind of men who settled accounts with bullets in dark alleys, the kind of men who made problems disappear so thoroughly that no one ever found enough pieces to identify what remained. The storm swallowed them all, the warrior and the woman, the mob, and the gallows, the town, and its shame, in a whiteout so complete that within moments, those who stood at the edge of the gathering could no longer see those at its center. It was as if the world itself had decided to draw a curtain over the scene, neither condemning nor absolving, merely erasing it temporarily from sight, while the players regrouped for whatever act would come next in this drama that had only just begun. Alma Cartwright's cabin sat on a parcel of poor land just beyond Thunder Mesa's official limits in that ambiguous zone where town ended and wilderness began. The structure had been built by her husband Samuel before a mining accident had crushed him beneath a tunnel collapse in 1853, leaving her a widow at 58, with nothing but this cabin, 3 laying hens, and a reputation as a woman who knew herbs and midwifery. The building was humble, rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and prairie grass, a roof of pine shingles that leaked in 3 places during heavy rain. A single room divided by blankets hung from rope into sleeping area, cooking area, and the corner where Alma kept her medicines. A pot-bellied stove made in Pittsburgh and hauled west at great expense squatted in the center like a black iron heart, radiating heat in a circle that grew weaker the farther you moved from its source. It was to this cabin that Goyathle carried Hazel Kowalczyk, half dragging and half lifting her through snow that had drifted waist-high in places, his injured legs screaming protest with each step, but his arms steady as he held her weight. By the time they reached Alma's door, both were soaked through from the snow and gasping from exertion. Naira, the elder of the 2 children, pushed the door open from inside her small face, anxious, and then stepped quickly aside as Goyathle carried the woman through into the blessed warmth. He laid her on the straw mattress in Alma's sleeping corner as gently as if she were made of spun glass. She had lost consciousness somewhere during the walk, whether from pain or cold or simple exhaustion, he could not tell. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her skin the color of old parchment, her lips tinged blue at the edges. Alma moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen death often enough to know its approach and respected it enough not to waste time. She knelt beside the mattress and began cutting away Hazel's torn clothing with a pair of sewing scissors, working quickly, but carefully exposing the extent of injuries that made even Goyathle, who had seen men flayed alive by Comanche warriors, draw in a sharp breath. The woman's torso was a canvas of bruises in various stages of healing, mapped in green and yellow and purple-black. Several ribs on her left side were cracked, visible as depressions beneath the skin when she breathed. Her wrists bore rope burns that had become infected, oozing clear fluid that smelled of corruption. But it was her feet that drew the eye and held it swollen to twice their normal size. The flesh split open in multiple places, black tissue at the toes, speaking of frostbite that had progressed too far to be fully reversed. "We need Dr. Crane," Alma said grimly, not looking up from her examination. "Those feet, if we do not act quickly, she will lose them both. Perhaps more." Goyathle nodded and turned to leave, but Naira, wise beyond her 10 years, stepped forward. "I will go," she said in Apache. "You are limping badly, Uncle. You have carried her all this way. Let me run to fetch the doctor while you rest." He hesitated, then nodded. The girl was right. His leg was barely holding him upright. He pressed a silver dollar into her hand, an enormous sum, and said, "Tell him Alma needs him urgently. Tell him there will be payment. Run fast, little rabbit." Naira pulled her blanket tight and vanished into the storm. Der Farker. Elias Crane arrived perhaps 40 minutes later, reeking of whiskey and looking like he had been dragged backward through hell. He was perhaps 55 years old, thin as a scarecrow, with a drinker's broken veins webbing his nose and cheeks. His hands trembled constantly, except when they touched a patient, at which point they became steady as stone. Then the mysterious grace that afflicted many medical men who were drunks and failures in every other aspect of their lives, but somehow remained gifted healers. He knelt beside the mattress and examined Hazel's feet in silence for a long moment. Then he sat back on his heels and addressed Alma without taking his eyes off the patient. "Another 12 hours, and we would be amputating at the ankle, maybe higher. As it is, she will probably lose 3 toes, possibly 4. The tissue is dead. You can see the demarcation line here and here, where the living flesh ends and the mortified flesh begins. But if we act now, we can save most of the foot. It will not be pretty, and she will walk with pain for the rest of her life, but she will walk. Then tell me what you need, Alma said. Boiling water, all you have. Whiskey, the strongest available. Clean linen torn into strips. My bag is outside, Naira can fetch it. And I will need someone strong to hold her down, because what I am about to do will hurt more than anything she has experienced thus far. And that is saying something given what has been done to her. Goyathle stepped forward. I will hold her. Elias looked at him appraisingly, noting the way he favored his left leg and the exhaustion in his eyes, the blood on his sleeve from where a bullet had grazed him years ago and never quite healed properly. You sure this is not going to be pleasant to watch? I have seen worse, Goyathle said quietly. I have done worse. I will hold her. The surgery for that is what it was, though it took place in a cabin rather than a proper medical theater, lasted nearly 2 hours. Alma set 4 pots of water to boil, while Elias unpacked his bag straight-edge razors honed to a terrifying sharpness, a small bone saw for the toes that would need to come off needles and catgut for stitching, and a slender iron rod that he placed directly into the coals of the stove to heat until it glowed orange. When Hazel regained consciousness, brought back to awareness by the pain of Elias probing her wounds, she thrashed and tried to pull away, her eyes wild with terror and incomprehension. Goyathle moved quickly, positioning himself behind her on the mattress and pinning her upper body against his chest, his arms wrapped around her in a grip that was firm but not cruel. She fought him with desperate strength, keening low in her throat like a wounded animal. Be still, he said in English, his voice low and steady near her ear. The doctor will help you, but you must be still, or you will make it worse. She did not seem to hear him. She was somewhere else, somewhere beyond language, trapped in memories of other times she had been held down, while men did painful things to her body. So Goyathle did something he had learned long ago when comforting his sister's children after they woke from nightmares. He began to sing a low, rhythmic chant in Apache, one of the old songs his mother had taught him, a song about the sun rising over the mountains and the promise that darkness always ended if you could endure long enough to see the dawn. He sang it over and over, the words becoming a kind of heartbeat, and slowly, very slowly, Hazel's struggles lessened. Her breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, began to match the rhythm of his chest, rising and falling against her back. Good, Elias muttered. Keep doing that. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it. Then he began to cut. The first incision, removing the necrotic tissue from her big toe, made Hazel stiffen and cry out a sound that was wordless and raw, and seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. Goyathle held her tighter, never stopping his song, his voice steady, even as he felt her pain as if it were his own. Elias worked with the focused intensity of a craftsman working on a piece he would be judged by, cutting away dead flesh until he reached tissue that bled properly, bright red, not the sluggish dark ooze that meant infection had taken hold. He poured whiskey directly into the wounds, which made Hazel arch her back and scream, the sound muffled against Goyathle's shoulder. Then came the worst part, cauterization. He pulled the iron rod from the fire, glowing orange-white radiating heat that could be felt 6 inches away, and pressed it to each of the major bleeding points in sequence. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, sharp and meaty and utterly unmistakable. Hazel convulsed with each touch, her screams now reduced to hoarse whimpers because she no longer had voice enough to scream properly. Through it all, Goyathle held her and sang his voice, never wavering his grip, never loosening, becoming the anchor that kept her from flying apart entirely. When it was finally over, wounds cleaned, dead tissue removed, bleeding stopped, and bandages wrapped, Hazel lay limp in his arms, conscious but utterly spent, her face the color of ash, sweat cooling on her skin. Elias cleaned his instruments with the methodical care of a man who had learned that infections killed more people than bullets, then packed his bag and stood with a wince that suggested his own body was staging a revolt against the demands he placed upon it. "Change the dressings twice daily," he said to Alma. "Watch for red streaks moving up the leg. That means blood poisoning. And if you see it, send for me immediately. Keep her off those feet entirely, for at least a week longer if possible. Feed her broth and bread if she can keep it down. And," he looked at Goyathle, "whatever you did to keep her calm, you may need to do it again. The pain will be worse tomorrow when her body truly registers what has been done. She will need something to hold on to." Goyathle nodded. He had not yet released Hazel, who had fallen into an exhausted half-sleep, her head resting against his chest, her breathing slow and steady now. Alma looked at them both for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. "She can stay in my sleeping corner for now," Alma said. "We will work out more permanent arrangements when she has strength for walking." Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Hazel slept most of the first 48 hours, waking only when Alma needed to change her bandages or coax broth down her throat. When she was awake, she watched Goyathle with wary, evaluating eyes, trying to understand what manner of man would risk his life for a stranger trying to find the trap, or the obligation that must surely come. She had learned through bitter experience that no one did anything without expecting payment. And she was trying to determine what form that payment would take. But Goyathle made no demands. He brought firewood and kept the stove fed. He went out in the bitter cold to hunt, returning with rabbits and once a young deer that fed them all for a week. He sat by the fire in the evenings and carved small animals from scraps of wood, a wolf, a bear, a bird, which he gave to Naira and Ceci to play with. And sometimes when Hazel woke from nightmares crying out in Polish, he would move to sit near her mattress and hum that same Apache song until her breathing calmed and she drifted back to sleep. On the third day, she finally spoke to him directly in halting English. "What you want from me?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from screaming. "You save me, you bring me here, you risk your life." "What I must pay," Goyathle looked up from the hide he was working, stretching and scraping it clean with a curved knife. "You owe nothing," he said simply. "Everyone wants something." Hazel insisted, frustration sharpening her tone. "No one do this for free. So what you want? I have no money. I have nothing. What you want?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain something he himself did not fully understand. Finally, he said, "My sister had a name, Dawa. It means sun in our language. She died 3 winters ago of the spotted sickness. She left 2 children with no mother, no father. I promised her before she died that I would care for them, that I would keep them safe." He gestured at Naira and Ceci, who were playing quietly in the corner. "When I saw you kneeling in the snow waiting to die, I saw someone who could have been her, someone who deserved better than to be killed by a mob because she fought back against men who hurt her. So I did what I could. That is all. There is no debt." Hazel stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for signs of deception and finding none. "You are strange, man," she said finally. "Good, I think. But strange." "Perhaps," he agreed with the ghost of a smile. "But in my experience, all good people are strange. The ones who fit easily into the world as it is, those are the ones you must watch carefully." She thought about this, then nodded slowly. After another pause, she said, "I am Hazel. Hazel Kowalczyk, from village near Krakow in Poland. My father was clerk. He teach me read, write numbers. When he die and my mother die, I have nothing. Agent come promise work in America. Promise husband home future. I sign papers I not understand. They put me on ship, and when ship arrive in America, her voice hardened. They sell me like cow, like animal. Put me in place with other women. Make us wash, cook. Make us do other things. And when I fight, they chain me. And when I fight more, they bring man named Pike to... She stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. You do not need to speak of it, Goyathle said gently. No, she said fiercely. I will speak, because if I not speak is like it did not happen, is like they win. She took a breath. Pike he bring young girl, maybe 14 years. She cry, she call for mother. He drag her to back room. I take knife from kitchen, long knife for cutting meat, and I put knife in Pike's side here. She touched her own ribs, and I twist, he fall, girl run. I take ledger book with all records, all names, all crimes, and I strap it to body and I run into storm. Wagon find me later. Guards say they take me back for trial for hanging. But wagon crash in storm. Guards die. I not die. I not know why. And then you find me. Goyathle absorbed this in silence. After a moment he said, the ledger. You still have it? Yes, she said. And there was fierce possession in her voice. They not take it from me. I keep it even when they put chains on me. It is proof. Proof of what they did. Without it, I am just murderer. With it, I am witness. You understand? I understand, he said. Where is it now? She gestured toward the corner where her torn clothing had been piled. In my dress. Inside. I sew pocket to hide it. You want to see? Not now, he said. But when the judge comes, and he will come once the storm breaks, you will need to show him. The book will speak for you more clearly than words. If I live long enough for judge to come? Hazel said grimly. The man, Remy the Frenchman, he want this book very much. He will try to kill me for it. You know this, yes? Yes, Goyathle said. I know this. Which is why I am here, and why I will remain here until the judge arrives, or until Remy makes his move. Whichever comes first. On the 7th night after Hazel's rescue, Margaret Hale arrived at the cabin long after dark, her face pale with cold, and something else, fear perhaps, or excitement. She carried a small brass key clutched in her gloved hand. I stole this, she said without preamble, holding it up to the lamplight. From the mine clerk's vest, while he was passed out drunk in the saloon's back room. It took me 3 nights of waiting for the right opportunity, and if he discovers it missing before we can return it, he will know someone has been at the ledgers. Hazel's eyes widened. She struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing feet. That is key to company safe. No? Margaret said. This is the key to the ledger's lock. The one you took is the master copy, the only one with all the details. I saw it once 2 years ago when Remy needed me to verify some numbers. It has a small brass lock on the spine. This key opens that lock. With shaking hands, Hazel retrieved the ledger from its hiding place. It was larger than Goyathle had expected, perhaps 12 inches tall and 9 inches wide, bound in brown leather worn smooth by handling. And yes, there on the spine was a small brass lock tarnished with age, but intact. Margaret inserted the key. It turned with a soft click that seemed loud in the hushed cabin. They gathered around Alma's table, Alma herself, Goyathle, Margaret Elias, who had been staying close to monitor Hazel's recovery, and Hazel, who insisted on being carried to the table despite Elias's protests. Even the children crept close, though Alma tried to shoo them to bed. Hazel opened the ledger to a random page and began to explain in her careful accented English. This looked like normal mining records, yes, dates, quantities, prices, but is code. Type A, this is real mining equipment, tools, supplies. Type B, her finger traced a column. This is women. Type B stock. See here, 4 Type B Odessa route received Green Valley 15 sept. This means 4 women arrived by Odessa Freight Company, delivered to Green Valley, then brought here. She flipped forward several pages. And here, lost stock fee Green Valley road payment to F45 Valandast. This means women who disappear, who are killed or sold somewhere else, somewhere not recorded. Payment to F. This is payment to someone they trust to make problems disappear quietly. Who is F? Margaret asked, leaning closer. I not know for certain, Hazel admitted. But payments to F are regular. Every month, sometimes twice. Always for lost stock or escort services. Someone local, someone who know roads and hiding places. Goyathle, who had been studying the entries in silence, suddenly said, Finn Bracken, the potato farmer. He has been struggling since his wife died. He does odd jobs for the mine. He knows every back road and canyon within 50 miles. The name settled over the group like a shroud. Everyone knew Finn, a quiet, sad man who traded vegetables for supplies and never caused trouble. The idea that he might be complicit in this horror was almost harder to accept than the horror itself. But Hazel was not finished. She flipped to a different section of the ledger, one filled with numbers that looked like routine financial records. And this is why Remy's so desperate. Look, silver extracted 700 ounces. But silver shipped to company headquarters 500 ounces. 200 ounces missing. This happened every month, many months. Remy is stealing from company. If they find out... She drew a finger across her throat in the universal gesture. Company owners not send police. They send men who kill. So the ledger damns him twice over, Elias said slowly. Once for trafficking, once for embezzlement. He is desperate not just to avoid prison, but to avoid a bullet from his own employers. Exactly. Hazel confirmed. He will do anything to get this book back. Anything. As if summoned by her words, the front window exploded inward. The attack came with no warning. One moment they were gathered around the table in lamplight, and the next, a bottle wrapped in oil-soaked cloth came spinning through the shattered glass flames, already licking at its neck. It struck the far wall and burst splashing burning oil across Alma's calico curtains and the dry wood of the wall itself. Fire spread with terrifying speed, climbing toward the ceiling. Shouts erupted from outside. Boots hammered on the porch. Someone hit the front door with tremendous force once, twice. But Alma's oak bar held the wood, groaning, but not giving. Then the back door, flimsy, held only by a simple latch, exploded inward as a massive boot kicked it off its hinges. Cletus Hayes filled the doorway, and he was not alone. Behind him, 2 other men crowded close, all armed. Cletus held a Colt Dragoon revolver in one hand, the massive .44 caliber weapon looking almost small in his scarred, meaty palm. His eyes, glittering with excitement or fear or both, swept the room and fixed on Hazel. "The book," he growled. "Give us the cursed book, and the woman and the rest of you walk away. You got 3 seconds." Goyathle's Navy Colt was already in his hand, though no one had seen him draw. He had been a warrior before he was a scout, and a warrior's reflexes never truly left. He fired as Cletus's gun was swinging toward Alma, one shot center mass, the .36 caliber ball punching through Cletus's breastbone and mushrooming as it tore through his heart. The big man's eyes went wide with surprise, as if violence done to him was somehow more shocking than violence he had intended to commit, and he toppled backward through the doorway, dead before he hit the ground. The second man, younger, narrow-faced, lunged through the smoke at Alma, with a knife thinking her the easiest target. Dr. Elias, moving faster than anyone would have thought possible for a man his age, grabbed the boiling kettle from the stove and hurled its contents in one smooth arc. Scalding water caught the young man, full in the face and chest. His scream was high and thin and terrible, the sound of agony so intense it transcended language. He clawed at his scalded flesh, stumbled backward, and fled into the night, still screaming. The third attacker, seeing his companions dead and maimed, lost his nerve entirely and ran. But the fire was spreading. Flames had reached the ceiling now, consuming the dry pine with greedy enthusiasm. Smoke filled the cabin, thick and choking, making it nearly impossible to breathe or see. "Out!" Alma shouted, grabbing Naira with one hand and Ceci with the other. "Everyone out now." They fled into the night. Goyath lay, carrying Hazel Elias, dragging their supplies on a hastily loaded sled, Margaret clutching the precious ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Behind them, the cabin that had been Alma's home for 20 years surrendered to the flames, the roof collapsing inward with a roar like thunder and a fountain of sparks that rose into the dark sky like souls ascending. They stood in the snow watching it burn, while around them the night settled into an uneasy silence, broken only by the crackle of flames and the sound of their own ragged breathing. "We cannot stay here," Goyathle said quietly, stating what everyone already knew. "By morning, Remy will have the whole town searching for us. We need to find shelter somewhere we can defend if necessary, and we need to do it before we freeze to death out here. There is an old prospector's claim." Alma said, her voice remarkably steady for a woman who had just watched her home burn, about 5 miles northwest in the hills. "Samuel showed it to me once before he died. It is just a shaft driven into the hillside, but it has timber supports and would be shelter from the wind." "Can you find it in the dark?" Goyathle asked. "I can find it," she said with certainty. "I spent 40 years learning this land. I can find it." "Then we go," he said, "now before the fire draws more attention." And so they set out into the frozen wilderness, a strange band of refugees, an Apache warrior, a Polish immigrant woman, an old widow, a schoolteacher, a drunk doctor, and 2 frightened children fleeing into the night with nothing but what they could carry, and a ledger that held the power to destroy empires built on human suffering. Behind them, Thunder Mesa slept uneasily, and in the finest house in town, Remy Duchamp sat in his study and planned murder with the calm efficiency of a man who had long since made peace with what he was willing to do to preserve what he had built. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, 7 souls, and a sled loaded with everything they owned that mattered, which when reduced to essentials was pitifully little. The storm had eased somewhat, though the cold remained murderous, settling into their bones with the patience of something that knew it had all the time in the world to kill them. Goyathle led breaking trail through drifts that sometimes reached his waist, his injured legs screaming protest with each step, but his pace never faltering. Behind him came Alma, guiding them by landmarks, visible only to her, a lightning-scarred pine, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear. The particular way the wind howled through a narrow canyon that told her they were heading in the right direction. Hazel rode on the sled wrapped in every blanket they possessed, the ledger clutched to her chest like a child holding a doll. Her feet, barely healed from the surgery, had begun bleeding again, from the rough treatment seeping dark stains through the bandages. She bit her lip until it bled rather than cry out and slow them down, understanding with perfect clarity that her pain was nothing compared to the death that would find them all if they stopped moving. The children walked between Margaret and Elias, each adult holding a small hand, lifting the little ones over obstacles they could not climb themselves. Naira, brave as any warrior, did not complain, though tears froze on her cheeks. Ceci had stopped crying altogether, retreating into that terrible silence that sometimes claimed children who had seen too much. They reached the abandoned prospector's claim, perhaps 3 hours after fleeing Alma's burning cabin, though it felt like 3 years. The entrance was exactly as Alma had remembered, a dark mouth in the hillside, half hidden by brush and drifted snow timber supports, visible just inside like the ribs of some great beast. They stumbled inside and collapsed too exhausted even to celebrate their survival. The shaft extended perhaps 40 feet into the hill, wide enough for 3 people to stand abreast, tall enough that Goyathale could stand upright without bumping his head. The air inside was damp and cold, but blessedly still free of the wind that had been trying to flay the skin from their faces. Old mining equipment lay scattered about, rusted picks, a broken sluice box, coils of rope that had gone brittle with age. "We need fire." Goyathale said, his voice hoarse from breathing cold air. "But we must be careful with the smoke. Too much and it will pool at the entrance, visible for miles. We build small, just enough for warmth." They gathered what burnable wood they could find inside the shaft, old timbers that had fallen, fragments of crates, even the handle from a broken pick. Goyathale built the fire with the careful precision of someone who had learned the skill as a child and refined it through necessity. Small, hot, nearly smokeless, a fire for survival, not comfort. As warmth began to seep into the shaft, they took stock of their situation. They had food for perhaps 3 days, if they rationed carefully some jerked venison, a sack of flour, dried beans. Water was not a problem. They could melt snow. But between them and Thunder Mesa stood Remy Duchamp's wealth and rage. And between them and anywhere else stood 100 miles of winter wilderness that killed the unwary with casual indifference. "We wait for the judge," Margaret said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "He is expected within the week. If we can stay hidden until he arrives." "Remy will not wait," Goyathale interrupted. "He will organize search parties. He will offer rewards. Men will come looking, and this shaft is not hidden well enough to survive a thorough search. We have perhaps 2 days, maybe 3, before someone stumbles across our trail." "Then what do we do?" Alma asked, though she already knew the answer. "We go back," Goyathale said. "We return to Thunder Mesa with the ledger, and we find the judge ourselves. We do not wait for him to find us, we go to him. It is our only chance." "That is madness," Elias said flatly. "Remy owns half the town. We walk back there, we are walking into a noose." "Perhaps," Goyathale agreed. "But staying here means freezing or starving. Running farther means dying in the wilderness, with the evidence that could save Hazel still locked in that book. At least in Thunder Mesa there are witnesses. There are laws, however corrupt. There is a chance, however small, that justice might prevail." They argued in circles for an hour, but in the end they all knew he was right. Staying meant slow death. Running meant swift death. Returning to Thunder Mesa meant the possibility, however slim, of life. They slept fitfully that night, huddled together for warmth around the dying fire. And in the darkest hour before dawn, when even hope seemed to have abandoned them, and they heard a sound that made Goyathale reach for his revolver and roll silently to his feet. Footsteps. Stumbling uneven, the gait of someone at the very end of their strength. A figure appeared at the entrance to the shaft, backlit by the gray pre-dawn light, a man hunched and swaying one arm, hanging useless at his side, dark stains on his coat that could only be blood. "Please," the figure gasped. "Don't shoot. I need to confess." It was Finn Bracken. They dragged him inside, and in the firelight, his condition became clear. He had been shot, the bullet entering just above his left hip and exiting through his lower back, tearing through muscle and perhaps nicking the intestine, a wound that would kill slowly and painfully over the course of days. His left arm was wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, the hand swollen to twice its normal size, and turning black gangrene had set in, and the smell of rotting flesh was unmistakable. "Remy's men," Finn said through teeth clenched against pain. "They came to my farm 3 nights ago. Said I was a loose end. Said I knew too much. I fought, broke one man's jaw with a shovel, but they shot me. Left me for dead. Should be dead. Don't know why I'm not. Elias examined the wounds with hands that had steadied despite the tremors that normally plagued them. You will be dead soon, he said bluntly. Hours, not days. The gut wound has festered. The gangrene is spreading. I can give you whiskey for the pain, but there is nothing else to be done. I am sorry. Don't be sorry, Finn said. I deserve this. I deserve worse than this. He looked at Hazel, who sat on the ground nearby, her gray eyes fixed on him with an expression that gave away nothing. You know what I did. The ledger, I'm the F in the ledger. I led women into the wilderness and left them there. Took money for it. Told myself they were criminals, troublemakers, that they'd find their way to somewhere else. Told myself lies so I could sleep at night and feed my family. How many? Hazel asked, her voice flat. 17. Finn whispered, and tears began to track through the grime on his face. 17 women over 2 years. I didn't kill them directly, just took them 20-30 miles out and left them with a little food and water and pointed them toward Fort Laramie. Told myself they'd make it. Told myself someone would find them. But I knew. In my heart, I knew. Why you tell us this now? Hazel demanded. Why now when you are dying? Why not before, when telling truth could save them? Finn closed his eyes, and his voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. 3 nights ago, before they shot me, Remy gave me one more job. A sick girl from the compound, fever, coughing blood, barely 15 years old. He told me to take her far out into the hills and leave her to die. And when I looked at that girl, his voice broke completely. She had the same hair as my daughter Sarah. Same age, same frightened eyes. Sarah died 2 years back, consumption. And I thought, what if someone had been paid to take Sarah out into the wilderness and leave her to die alone? What if someone had taken money to watch my little girl freeze? He looked up at Hazel, his eyes pleading for something he knew he did not deserve. I couldn't do it. I hit the guard instead. Broke his jaw in 3 places. That's when they shot me. And I've been crawling through the snow for 3 days, trying to find someone, anyone who would listen to the truth. Because I can't die with this on my soul. I can't face Sarah in whatever comes after if I don't at least try to make it right. The shaft was silent, except for the crackle of the fire and Finn's labored breathing. Finally, Hazel spoke. You tell us now where the bodies are, where you leave them. Yes, Finn said eagerly. All 17. I remember every place. I drew a map. He fumbled in his coat with his good hand and pulled out a piece of paper, folded and refolded until it was nearly falling apart. Every location, every date I remember. It's not much, but it's something. They deserve to be buried proper. They deserve to have their names spoken. Hazel took the map, studied it in the firelight, and then looked at Goyathle. Something passed between them, a question asked and answered without words. We take him with us, Goyathle said. When we return to Thunder Mesa, he comes too. He testifies. He tells the judge everything, and he gives them this map. It will not save him. Nothing can save him now, but it might save others. And it might give those 17 women the dignity of a proper grave. He not deserve mercy, Hazel said, but there was no heat in her voice, only exhaustion. But maybe he deserved chance to do one thing right before he die. Finn wept, then great racking sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside him. Thank you, he gasped between sobs. Thank you. I don't deserve it. I know I don't. But thank you. They wrapped him in blankets and gave him water and the last of the whiskey for the pain. And as the day brightened outside the shaft entrance, Goyathle and Hazel sat together near the fire while the others slept, and for the first time since he had found her by the river, they spoke of things deeper than survival. "Your sister," Hazel said quietly. "You say her name was Dawa. She was younger than you." 3 years younger, Goyathle confirmed, staring into the flames. "When we were children, she used to follow me everywhere. Our mother said she was my shadow. She married too young, I thought, but her husband was a good man, a warrior named Chato. He died fighting the Ute, and she raised the children alone for 2 years before the sickness came." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I was with the army when she died. 200 miles away, chasing Lakota raiders who had stolen cavalry horses. I didn't even know she was sick until a messenger found me and told me she was already buried. When I returned, Naira and Ceci had been living with an old aunt who could barely feed herself, much less 2 children. Naira, she was 8 years old. She looked at me and said, 'Mother told me you would come. She said you always keep your promises.'" His voice roughened. "But I didn't keep my promise. I wasn't there when she needed me. So I made a new promise to those children, to Dawa's memory, that I would never abandon them again. That is why I left the army. That is why I am here in this frozen hell instead of with my mother's people in the southern camps. Because family is not just blood. It is the promises we keep when keeping them costs us everything." Hazel was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Then she said, "In my village, my father, he was good man like you. He teach me to read when I am 6 years old. This was strange thing to teach girl. Other men laugh at him, say I should learn to cook and so not waste time with books. But he say," her accent thickened as she reached for the memory. "He say, the world takes many things from us, Hazel. It takes our health, our money, our homes. But knowledge they cannot take unless we give it away. So I give you knowledge, and no one can ever make you poor again." She touched the ledger beside her. He was wrong, of course. They take everything anyway. But he was right too. Because I know how to read this book. I know how to make the numbers speak truth. And that is why they cannot win. Because I carry the evidence inside my head, even if they burn the book. I am the witness they cannot silence, except by killing me. "They will not kill you," Goyathle said with quiet certainty. "I will not allow it." Hazel looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the weathered face and the warrior's exterior to something deeper. "Why you care so much, I am stranger. I am foreign woman, not your people. You risk everything for me." "Why?" Goyathle met her gaze and held it. "Because when I found you by the river, frozen and chained and more dead than alive, I saw someone who refused to surrender even when surrender would have been easier. I saw someone who chose to fight for something larger than themselves, for truth, for justice, for those who had no voice. And I thought, this is someone worth saving. This is someone who makes the world better simply by being in it and refusing to give up." He reached out and took her hand, scarred, work-worn, strong despite everything. "And somewhere in these past days, between the surgery and the fire and the flight into the wilderness, you became not just someone I was protecting, but someone I—" He paused, searching for the right English words. "Someone I care for. Deeply. Not because you are beautiful, though you are. Not because you owe me anything, because you do not. But because your spirit calls to something in my spirit. Because when I am near you, I feel less alone than I have felt since Dawa died." Hazel's eyes widened, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. Not tears of sorrow, but of something else. Something like relief or recognition or the first tentative hope that perhaps not all men were monsters, perhaps not all the world was cruelty. "I care for you too," She whispered in Polish, then repeated it in English so he would understand. I not know when it happened. Maybe when you breathe with me during surgery. Maybe when you carry me through snow even though your leg is hurt. Maybe little by little every time you are kind when you could be cruel. But it's true. I care for you. I think maybe I... She stopped, unable or unwilling to speak the larger word that hovered between them. You do not need to say it, Goyatle said gently. Not yet. We have time. When this is over, when the judge has heard the truth and Remy has been stopped, then we will have time to speak of what comes next. For now, it is enough to know we are not alone. Yes, Hazel agreed, and she let her head rest against his shoulder, her hand still in his. Is enough. They sat that way as the day brightened outside, as the others began to wake and stir, as Finn Bracken's breathing grew more labored, and the smell of gangrene grew stronger. They sat together, two broken people finding strength in each other, and they made plans for what would come next, for the return to Thunder Mesa, for the confrontation with Remy, for the justice that might finally be within reach, if they could survive just a little longer. They waited 2 days in the shaft for Finn to stabilize enough to travel, knowing even as they waited that he was dying, that every hour brought him closer to the end. But he insisted, begged really to be taken back to Thunder Mesa, to be allowed to testify before he died. And so, on the third morning, when the storm had eased to occasional flurries, and the temperature had risen to something merely brutal rather than lethal, they began the journey back. Finn rode on the sled wrapped in blankets and barely conscious, his face the color of old parchment. Elias walked beside him, checking his pulse every few minutes, administering what little comfort whiskey and kind words could provide. The rest of them took turns breaking trail, the work so exhausting that even 15 minutes at the front left them gasping and trembling. They reached Thunder Mesa late in the afternoon of the second day, approaching from the north along the Snake River, using the same route Goyatle had taken when rescuing Hazel. The town came into view, slowly emerging from the white landscape, like a ship appearing through fog. And waiting for them on the high bank above the river was Remy Duchamp and what looked like half the population of Thunder Mesa. They had built the gallows again. The rope swung in the wind, patient and ready. I knew you would come back. Remy called down his voice, carrying clearly despite the wind. His face was flushed, whether from cold or triumph was impossible to say. You have nowhere else to go. No supplies, no shelter, winter at your back, and my men at every road. You come back to die, or you die in the wilderness. Either way, you die. We come back for justice, Goyatle called back. The judge arrives today. We saw his sleigh on the eastern road. By nightfall, he will be here, and he will hear what we have to say. This was a lie. They had seen no judge. But it was a lie designed to buy time, to make Remy hesitate long enough for something to shift in their favor. But Remy laughed a sound without humor. There is no judge coming. The storm has blocked the passes. He will not arrive for weeks, if at all. And by then, you will all be frozen corpses, and your precious ledger will be ash. Then take the ledger. Hazel called out, her voice steady despite the fear that must have been churning in her gut. You want it so badly. Come and get it. She held the book aloft, its leather cover dark against the white snow clearly visible from the bank. Remy's eyes locked onto it with an intensity that bordered on madness. Give it to me, he said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. Give it to me now, and I let the others go. Just you and the Apache hang. The rest walk free. That is my offer. No? Hazel said simply. Then you all die. Remy screamed, and he started down the bank toward the ice, his expensive boots slipping and sliding on the steep slope. Sheriff Miles and several other men followed, though, with notably less enthusiasm. The townsfolk who had gathered, and there were perhaps 40 of them, hung back watching, but not participating. Some looked ashamed. Others looked merely cold and eager for this to be over, so they could return to their warm homes. Goyathle stepped onto the ice, leading his small band, like a general leading troops into battle. The surface groaned beneath his weight, producing that soft, conversational sound that meant the ice was thinner than it appeared, that death waited just beneath the fragile covering. They moved slowly, carefully, spreading out to distribute their weight. Hazel walked beside Goyathle, the ledger clutched to her chest. Behind them came Alma with the children, then Margaret and Elias supporting Finn on his litter, made from branches and blankets. Remy came straight at them, no longer caring about caution driven by desperation that had moved beyond reason into pure animal need. He had to have that ledger. Everything depended on it, his fortune, his freedom, his life. Without it, he was finished. "Give me the book," he shouted, and now he had drawn his dragoon revolver, the massive weapon looking like a small cannon in his hand. "You want it," Hazel called back. "Come take it from me." And she deliberately moved toward a darker patch of ice, a place where even from a distance, anyone could see the water moving beneath, could see the fragility of the surface. Remy saw it too. He hesitated for perhaps 2 seconds, calculating, weighing his need against the danger. Need one. He charged forward, boots pounding cracks, spreading beneath him in intricate webs. He was perhaps 10 feet from Hazel when Goyathle stepped between them, his navy colt in his hand. "Stop," Goyathle said quietly. "It is over, Remy. Even if you kill us all, even if you burn the book, Finn Bracken lives long enough to testify. The map is drawn. The truth is told. You have lost." "I have not lost." Remy screamed, and he swung his revolver toward Goyathle, his finger tightening on the trigger. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Remy's dragoon and Goyathle's navy colt, the reports overlapping into a single thunderclap. Remy's bullet tore across Goyathle's upper arm, spinning him, blood spraying. Goyathle's bullet took Remy in the left shoulder, punching through and continuing into the ice behind him. Both men staggered. Both stayed on their feet. And then the strap holding the ledger to Hazel's chest, that same harness leather strap that had survived so much, weakened by days of damp and stress and constant wear, chose that moment to snap with a soft, almost apologetic sound. The ledger tumbled from beneath her coat and began sliding across the slick surface toward the darkest patch, toward the hole where black water moved like silk. "No." Hazel and Remy screamed the word in perfect unison, their voices blending into something almost operatic in its desperation. Hazel threw herself forward in a flat dive, her hands stretching out, her chains clattering. Her fingers closed on the ledger just as the ice beneath her gave a warning crack. Remy lunged from the opposite direction, his wounded shoulder forgotten, his eyes locked on the book with manic intensity. They reached the ledger at the same instant, their hands touching the leather cover from opposite sides. And the ice, stressed beyond its capacity by their combined weight and the violence of their movements, surrendered. With a sound like a cannon firing, a section of ice, perhaps 6 feet across, gave way. Hazel felt herself sliding backward, pulled by her chains toward the black water. She clutched the ledger to her chest, even as the cold began to close around her legs, even as she felt the current tugging at her like a living thing, trying to pull her down and downstream and under the ice, where she would never be found. But Goyathle, wounded, bleeding his injured leg, barely holding him, threw himself flat and grabbed her around the waist, with one arm, his other hand hooking his rifle barrel around a solid crack line, becoming a bridge, an anchor, the thing that kept her from disappearing into the darkness. "Hold on." He gasped, his voice tight with pain and effort. "Hold on to me." Remy had not been so fortunate. He had been reaching across the hole when it gave way, and momentum carried him forward into the water. He went under for a moment, then surfaced, gasping and thrashing, his expensive coat suddenly transformed from a mark of status to a weight trying to drown him. He grabbed for the edge of the ice, but his gloved hands could find no purchase on the slick surface. "Help me!" He screamed no longer. The elegant Frenchman, but simply a terrified man facing death. "Please, someone help me." On the bank, Sheriff Miles made no move to help. Neither did anyone else. They simply watched, frozen not by cold, but by the terrible fascination of seeing a man who had held power over them reduced to helplessness. The current caught Remy, pulling him away from the hole's edge, pulling him toward the downstream ice shelf. He clawed at the ice, trying to arrest his progress, but the water was too strong. Through the fractured surface, they could see him for perhaps 5 seconds, a dark shape moving beneath the ice, his hands beating against the underside in futile desperation. Then he was gone, swept away into the black, and the river closed over the spot where he had been, as if he had never existed. It was at that precise moment, as Hazel and Goyeth were being pulled back onto solid ice by ropes thrown from the bank, as Remy's body was being swept downstream toward whatever waited in the cold and the dark, that a sound cut through the wind. A bell. The town's bell ringing clear and bright, and cresting the ridge overlooking the river, came a sleigh pulled by 2 exhausted horses carrying 3 men bundled in buffalo robes. Judge Marcus Stanislaus and 2 federal marshals, their badges visible even from a distance, their rifles clearly in hand. The judge took in the scene with a single sweep of his eyes, the broken ice, the blood on the snow, the mob with weapons drawn, and the ragged group of fugitives huddled on the riverbank, and the conspicuous absence of Remy Duchamp. "Someone," he said in a voice like thunder rolling across a vast plain, "had better explain to me what in the name of all that is holy has been happening in this God-forsaken town." The trial, such as it was, took place in the schoolhouse over the course of 3 days, with the judge hearing testimony from everyone involved and examining the ledger page by page, while a clerk carefully copied every entry. Hazel testified first, her broken English somehow more powerful for its imperfections, describing her journey from Poland to captivity to escape. She showed the judge her scars, the burns from the burlap, the rope marks on her wrists, the ruined feet, and she explained the code, translating each entry with a precision that came from months of forced intimacy with the document. Margaret testified about the missing girls, producing her carefully maintained list of names and dates. Alma testified about the women who had come to her door in the night, broken and afraid. Elias testified about injuries he had treated that could only have come from sustained violence and captivity. And Finn Bracken, propped up on his cot because he could no longer sit upright, testified for nearly 4 hours about every woman he had led into the wilderness, every payment he had received, every lie he had told himself to make it bearable. He produced his map, naming locations with the precision of someone who had carried the burden of memory for too long and was desperate to set it down. He died on the morning of the 4th day, while the judge was still deliberating. His last words spoken to Hazel were, "Tell them where Sarah is buried. Tell them I want to be buried beside her if they will allow it. Tell them I tried to make it right at the end." The judge's verdict came that afternoon. After hearing the evidence presented, he announced, his voice formal and terrible, "I find that the accusations against Miss Hazel Kowalczyk were false in their entirety. She did not commit murder. She committed justifiable homicide in defense of a child. She did not steal company property. She preserved evidence of crimes against herself and others. She is hereby cleared of all charges and declared a witness in federal case United States versus Duchamp et al." He looked around the packed schoolhouse. "Furthermore, I am issuing warrants for the arrest of 17 individuals named in the ledger, including contacts in Green Valley and agents operating from Boston." Federal marshals will execute these warrants immediately. Sheriff Miles, you are stripped of your badge and remanded to federal custody on charges of corruption and accessory to kidnapping. If convicted, you will hang. Miles, sitting in the front row with his hands already in irons, said nothing, his face ashen. The judge turned back to Hazel. Miss Kowalczyk, you are also awarded $500 from Remy Duchamp's seized assets as compensation for your suffering. Additionally, I am directing that the compound at Bitter Creek Mine be converted into a permanent refuge for immigrant women to be administered by Mrs. Cartwright and Miss Hale with your assistance if you are willing to provide it. Hazel, standing beside Goyathle with his hand in hers, nodded silently, unable to speak, past the tears that were flowing freely down her face. But the judge was not finished. He looked at Goyathle. The Apache Goyathle acted with courage and honor in protecting a witness and preserving evidence at great personal risk. As restitution for injuries suffered and in recognition of services rendered, I am granting him title to 160 acres of land along the creek northwest of here with full rights and protections under territorial law. May you build something lasting there. The schoolhouse erupted in applause, not from everyone, but from enough that it filled the space with sound that was almost like hope. Spring came to Utah territory the way it always did, slowly, grudgingly, as if winter was a lover who did not want to be abandoned. But it came nonetheless. By late March, the snow had begun to melt first in small patches, where sun hit stone, then in larger areas, where water gathered and ran in streams toward the swollen Snake River. The prairie started to show through brown at first, then spotted with the first tentative green shoots that spoke of life returning to a land that had seemed determined to remain dead forever. Goyathle built his cabin on the creek land the judge had granted him, working through April and into May, with a dedication that bordered on obsession. He built slowly, carefully, with an eye toward permanence rather than speed. The structure borrowed from both Apache and white building traditions, log walls chinked with mud, a roof of split pine shingles, 3 rooms that could be expanded as need required. Alma helped with the interior, bringing skills learned over 60 years of prairie living. Margaret contributed books for the children and helped Nara set up a corner for studying. Elias, who had finally truly stopped drinking, taught Ceci how to whittle, passing on the skill that Alma had once taught him. And Hazel came every day, walking the mile from the refuge where she now lived and worked, helping Mrs. Chen welcome newly arrived immigrant women and teaching them the skills they would need to survive in this harsh new world. She brought food, she brought news, she brought her ledger now carefully preserved in a locked box at the judge's office, but copied in her own hand so she could study it and learn from it. But mostly she came because Goyathle was there, and because somewhere in the winter just past, in the spaces between survival and death, she had fallen in love with a man who had saved her life, and then, more importantly, had helped her reclaim it. They did not rush into anything. Neither of them had the luxury of rushing. Both carried too many scars. Both had learned too many hard lessons about trust. But they built toward something slowly and carefully, the same way Goyathle built his cabin, 1 log at a time, 1 day at a time, checking and rechecking to make sure the foundation was solid before adding the next layer. One evening in June, as the sun set in brilliant reds and golds behind the mountains, they sat together on the porch of his finished cabin, watching Naira and Ceci chase fireflies in the meadow below. "I have been thinking," Hazel said, speaking slowly, as she always did when working through complex thoughts in English, about what comes next, about future. "And what do you think?" Goyathle asked. "I think," she paused, gathering courage. "I think I want to stay here, in this place, with these people, with you." She looked at him directly. "If you want me to stay." Goyathle reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the scars on her wrist and the marks that would never fully fade, but which had become, over time, less a symbol of what had been done to her, and more a symbol of what she had survived. "I want you to stay," he said quietly. "Not as someone I rescued, not as someone who owes me anything, but as someone I love, as someone I want to build a life with, if you will have me." Hazel's eyes filled with tears, happy tears this time. Tears that came from a place of joy rather than pain. "Yes," she said first in Polish and then in English. "Yes, I will have you. I will stay. I will build life here with you." They sealed the promise with a kiss, gentle and careful, the kiss of two people who had both been broken and who understood that healing was a slow process, not an event. When they finally pulled apart, Hazel rested her head against his shoulder and looked out at the land that was becoming theirs, at the children who were becoming theirs, at the future that was unfolding before them, like a road that finally led somewhere worth going. Inside the cabin, Alma was preparing supper. The smell of venison stew drifted out through the open door, along with the sound of her humming an old Irish tune. In the meadow, the children's laughter rang out pure and clear, a sound that seemed to wash away the memory of winter and everything terrible it had contained. And later that night, after the meal was finished and the children were in bed and Alma had returned to the refuge in town, Goyathle, and Hazel walked down to the creek together. There, by the light of a full moon, Hazel unwrapped the oilcloth package she had been carrying and revealed the ledger, the original, which the judge had returned to her after the trials were concluded. "I want to bury it," she said. "Not destroy it, it should not be forgotten, but bury it, so it does not define me anymore, so I can move forward instead of always looking back." Goyathle nodded. Together, they dug a hole at the base of a large cottonwood tree that grew at the creek's edge. The earth was soft and dark and smelled of life and growing things. They placed the wrapped ledger in the hole, covered it with soil, and then built a small cairn of river stones to mark the spot. When it was finished, Hazel stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. She looked at the cairn for a long moment, then at Goyathle, then back at the cairn. "Is finished," she said quietly. "The past is buried. Now we build future." "Yes," Goyathle agreed, and he took her hand and led her back toward the cabin, toward the light spilling from the windows, toward the life they were building together from the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy them. Behind them, the creek murmured over stones, and the wind moved through the cottonwood branches, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. Not a sound of threat, but simply a voice calling out into the darkness, saying, "I am here. I am alive. I have survived." And in the town of Thunder Mesa, Utah Territory, in the year of our Lord, 1857, two people who had every reason to hate the world, and everyone in it chose instead to love each other, to build something lasting from shared suffering, and to prove that even in the harshest landscape, even after the cruelest winter spring could still come, and life could still triumph over death. The town that had once called her a beast learned to call her by her name, Hazel Kowalczyk, survivor witness woman of courage. And the warrior who had once lived only for duty learned to live for love. And together, they built not just a cabin or a life, but a legacy, a reminder that justice, however delayed, could still be served, and that mercy, however hard won, was always worth fighting for.